See, when we try to understand as complex as a human being, what's going on in our insides and how we succumb to illnesses and what really happens when we are stuck with a disease, it's an extremely complex mechanisms that happens inside our body. To understand this, just like when we try to understand nature or astronomy, we use models. Physicists, for instance, use what's called classical mechanics after Newton. And then we have quantum mechanics. So these are the models that we use, the theories that we use to understand aspects of nature, aspects of the stars and astronomy. And similarly, we use certain models to understand human operating system. So the model that our ancient healers used was what we call holistic approach. By holistic, it means that there is the matter, there is the human flesh and bone that we are healing, and then there was this notion that there is a spirit or a soul that is responsible for the functioning of all these body parts. So they had to heal the body, the flesh and bone, the matter, and they also had to heal the soul or the spirit. So we had the healer of the soul and the healer of the body. So these two was one person. Plato, for instance, he lived about 2,400 years or so ago. He had this notion that in treating diseases, the physician ought to be the healer of the body, and he's also the healer of the spirit. And he worried that at some point in future we would separate these two, and he cautioned the healers not to do this, because only by treating the soul or the spirit and the body together, you are actually doing justice to the patient, to the individual. This was holistic medicine. This was personalized medicine to its core. So this went on for several centuries. So the village shaman or the healer or of the tribe would come out to the patient's house and diagnose whatever method he uses, and he would use herbs and oils and whatever he had at his disposal, and then he would also go back and what they call complete the spirit. He would use rituals and incantations and prayers and sacrifices even to heal the spirit. So he would treat both together, and this went on for a while. And roughly about 600 years before Christ, 600 BC, there arose a period in Greek medicine where reason started to dominate the practice. One of the individuals was Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a polymath. He was a philosopher, he was a mathematician, he was an astronomer, he was a politician, he was a priest. So he was all in one person. So he came up with this idea that the individual is a microcosm, which is a reflection of the macrocosm, what's out there in nature. So he would use the principles, the models he studied in nature and applied it to human beings. He would use what's called the principle of opposites. So he came up with this idea or theory or hypothesis, what we call now, that by balancing opposites, you can treat illnesses. So his hypothesis or theory was called Humoral Theory. He was one of the main patriarchs, the proponents of what we call Humoral Theory. Humoral Theory is simply balancing the different fluids within the body. Pythagoras felt that the human body contained a mixture of 4 humors. In this context, humor means fluids. The 4 fluids are black bile, yellow or red bile, blood, and phlegm. So these are the different fluids. These are the technical names that they actually gave, but it was not in English at the time. Blood was the life-giving fluid, and it became the most significant of the four humors because it provided nourishment to the body. When disordered, however, when there is an imbalance of blood, it caused inflammation and fever. And this is why the term blood poisoning for septicemia is still in use. So each individual possessed a particular humoral makeup. Now here he is personalizing this humoral makeup to individuals, and an imbalance of these were believed to result in deposition of noxious substances or toxic substances, leading to disease and even death. So medical practitioners therefore used therapeutic techniques that imitated the body's natural healing mechanisms to balance these humors. So the treatments consists of assisted expulsion of these toxins through the usual excretory organs, for instance, enemas and catharatics to increase bowel movements, expectorants to induce coughing, and diuretics to induce urination. And the most relied upon technique was bloodletting. This included cutting open the veins in selected parts of the body to bleed the patient of excess blood. These treatments purged the patient of these excess humors or fluids in the body, and so the individual is brought back to the equilibrium or balance of these fluids, and so that is how the diseases were treated at that time. This, as unscientific as it sounds, was the popular theory, and it made a lot of sense to the patient because they knew that what the patient was doing and what the physician was doing, and when the physician explained that this is what we're going to do because you have excess of blood, it made absolute sense to the patient, and they completely accepted this as the most effective treatment for a lot of diseases. This is treating the matter, which is the flesh and bones and the blood and the body part. And then we have treating the spirit. That is the second aspect of the treatment. So these physicians or the healers, being priests also, would use prayers and rituals and ceremonies and sacrifices to heal the spirit or to complete the spirit. And together it made total sense to the patients and the physicians. And this went on for almost 23 centuries. Nobody questioned it because this was backed by Pythagoras, and then came Hippocrates. He also supported this theory, but Hippocrates came a few hundred years after Pythagoras. He tried to introduce reason into medicine. He was the person who said, it is not the disease that matters, it is the person or the individual with the disease that the physician ought to treat. Although this concept or this notion is nothing new now, and it doesn't sound revolutionary, but it was revolutionary at that time. He genuinely tried to separate the priest from the physician so that the physician, the healer, is practicing within reason and not based on spiritual practices. But then came, about 400 years after Hippocrates, an individual who would change the fate of medicine. For almost 2,000 years. His name was Galen. Galen was an individual. He was charismatic. He attained celebrity status. Galen expanded the humoral theory, added several other elements to it, added several other philosophical theories to it. And his influence was so strong, so even hundreds of years later, Galen's teaching prevailed as last word in medicine, so much so that Galen's words became the language of medicine. As late as 1600s, to earn a diploma of Doctor of Medicine, students were required to recite an oath that included this line: fellows must never speak disrespectfully of Galen. Galen's theories became the foundation of authority of all medical writers and physicians, resulting in the establishment of a medical orthodoxy that went undisputed. Questioning Galen was tantamount to doubting the wisdom of the Greek lineage all the way to Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Hippocrates. Physicians just didn't learn from Galen, they worshipped his teachings as infallible notions with unshakable trust. Medicine as science could not progress until the field of science disregarded Galen's theories, but no one dared to question Galen. The reason why this was is for centuries, humanities included not only arts and politics and language, it also included science. So now we see science and humanities as two different paths to our profession. But in the ancient, not just in the ancient past, even up until 17th or 18th centuries, humanities included science. And a physician had to graduate in humanities to become the person of science and become a physician. So he had to study philosophy, he had to study art, and he was a polymath for centuries. And part of the training was training in philosophy. And medicine and spirituality went hand in hand. When Christianity in the Western Hemisphere, in the Western part of the world, rose to dominance, the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Christianity came to dominate the field of medicine because it took some of the philosophies of the Greek, in fact, some of the Aristotelian philosophies trickled into the teachings of Christianity. And so those philosophies became part of the physician's training. And so a physician continued to be a philosopher and a priest. But what happened was, even in 1600s, even up to 1700s, we did not know what was causing fevers. We blamed it on air, we blamed it on angering gods, deception, and diseases were a result of deception, disloyalty, theft, angering gods, and so on. And we called the reason for fever, we called it bad air, what we now call malaria, mal air. Mal air is bad air. That is what we attributed fevers to. So medicine could not progress any further because of this spiritual element. Biologists and physicians and healers could not cut and probe human body because human body was seen as a temple of spirit. And so they could not probe or cut or experiment upon the human body. So then came two influential personalities who would forever shake the foundation of this practice of medicine. It was Francis Bacon and René Descartes, the philosophers, who would forever change the fate of medicine and science in general. Francis Bacon touched medicine at several points, predominantly regarding the introduction of methods to study human physiology. It was primarily because of Bacon that the 16th century became the bedrock of experimental studies. He started a revolution in understanding the natural world by changing the face of exploration through his fearless approach. He became convinced that the only types of theories worth considering were the ones that could be put to test. The crux of his idea lied in the basic logic that the accumulation of facts by mere observation, which had been the method used for centuries prior, was not sufficient to study nature. In modern times, we take this understanding entirely for granted, but this was a radical notion then. Although this idea may be touched upon in ancient and medieval periods, Bacon was the first to formalize the method for investigating nature. So, up until that time, we had a lot of theories about how the human operating system worked, But what we lacked was a method to test those theories. Francis Bacon was first among who revolutionized this approach. And this was supported by René Descartes, who felt that nature and human body was like a clock-like mechanism. So between these two giants, who were also philosophers, they devised, or they at least helped come up with this idea of testing our theories. So when we have a hypothesis, we lacked a method to test those hypotheses. It was the first time in our human history there was a push towards testing what we proposed. This became the foundation of scientific method. By this time, physicists and chemists and mathematicians started gathering into scientific societies and used the scientific method to prove or disprove their theories. But physicians were lacking, or physicians were hesitant to join these scientific communities even at that time. The notion was that human body was too complex to subject to experimentation and testing and analysis, and therefore medicine was still regarded as an art. And physicians and the healers refused to join scientific communities and treat this medicine as a branch of science. But with the push of Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and some of the healers and the practitioners, physicians quickly realized that without experimentation, their understanding of human biology would be severely limited. So they started agreeing to experiment on human body. But there was a limitation, experimenting on human biology, which was not there while experimenting by physicists or chemists or mathematicians. Physicists, math, and chemists can experiment in laboratories, in controlled environments. But human biology is too complex. If you look at how human biology functions, it's what we call multidirectional, which means several variables act at once. But scientific experiments are done in a linear fashion. You have to, what we call, control all these variables so that you can study one equation or one function at a time. Human mind cannot grasp more than 2 or 3 variables at a time, and if that had to be done, we needed another assistance. We needed another method to test human biology and human functioning and physiology in the laboratories.